Welcome to the Superintendent's Hangout, where we discuss topics in education, charter schools, life in general, and not necessarily in that order. I'm your host, Dr. Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. In this episode, I sat down with a friend of mine, Brian Colin. Brian is managing director at Baird and is a nationally acclaimed expert in charter school finance. He has over 30 years of experience in public finance, and prior to joining Baird, he managed the National Charter School Group at a leading investment banking firm. Brian has structured and completed several hundred charter school financings, providing over $9 billion in funding for charter school capital projects nationwide. That's from his bio. Brian and I have a wide-ranging conversation that touches on various aspects of charter school law, parental choice, and the various ways that charter schools can proceed in acquiring facilities to run their programs. Brian is a delightful interviewee, and if you can hear the drilling in the background as I record this introduction, it's because there's a building renovation going on right beneath my office where I'm recording this, and I think that's appropriate for the subject of charter school facilities that has been Brian's life for several decades. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did recording it. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for coming in and to the Superintendent's Hangout and spending a little bit of time today.
Well, thanks for the invite. We appreciate the chance to catch up.
Yeah, since I started this podcast, I've thought about speaking with you, or in general, speaking with folks with experience in the financial sector, specifically related to facilities, and you in particular because of your deep expertise. I was wondering if you could start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what your background is, and what brings you to the present moment where you're wearing a Hawaiian shirt, looking out over the beautiful background of Denver, Colorado.
Yeah, just from kind of an overview. So I've been working in the bond area for a long time, and then really focused kind of my efforts and my team's efforts really since 2003. That was originally at another firm for a little while, and then took most of my group over to Baird, where we've been lucky enough to work with charter schools nationwide since that time. And, to date, we've actually just breached over $9 billion of financings for, charter schools, charter school networks across the country. So it was sort of a kind of an accident to get involved in this particular sector, because I had been working in sort of governmental type financing with states and cities and transportation agencies. And then a friend of mine came to me with the need to do some financing for some folks that he knew in some schools, initially in Colorado and Arizona. And those went extremely well in the early 2000s, and then kind of branched out from there. So again, it's been, I can't even remember. It's been over 300 transactions easily, and again, over $9 billion. And we've kind of grown with the sector. So it's been a very active kind of enterprise.
And I imagine, so you've been with Baird, how long did you say?
With Baird since about 13 years, and then over 30 years in sort of the bond industry, if you will.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a fairly new area, right, of expertise, a niche area, facilities for charter schools. Can you talk to us a little bit about the differences between the way a traditional school district goes about obtaining facilities, school buildings, and the way that charter schools go about it?
Yeah, good question. So, with school districts, with kind of rare exceptions, they tend to go to the voters and get bond issues passed. And the difference between that and how a charter school does it is that they have the full faith and credit of the school district, the full taxing power on all accessible land within that jurisdiction. to back up their bonds. So their bonds tend to be very highly rated because the chance of a default on those bonds is very rare, because they have all of the real estate and all the full faith and credit and promise to assess, houses and commercial buildings, whatever is necessary to pay back those bonds. Charter schools don't have that luxury. Now, with some exceptions, which include your area of San Diego, there are some school districts that may add a piece of the taxing power and some of the monies they get to be used for charter schools, but that's very rare. And usually it's a very small component. It doesn't fit kind of the needs of all charter schools located within that school district. So charter schools are really out there on their own. The only thing that they can use to pay back the annual payments on the bonds is their operations. So the charter school has to generate enough excess, that is revenues minus expenses, and whatever's left over, to really pay for the facilities. So it's from a risk perspective to investors, it's a much higher risk, because you don't have what school districts have or what cities and states have. There's just one pot of money, and it tends to be the per pupil funding that follows the student to wherever they matriculate. So, if the child is worth $10,000 in Denver or San Diego or Wisconsin or whatever, wherever that child goes to school, the money tends to follow he or her to that school. And that's, of course, also tends to be a source of friction sometimes between school districts and charter schools.
So how does your team determine if it's even worth it to start the process of kind of vetting a charter school or a charter school organization, and then walk them through this whole process up to where bonds are sold and the project is funded and then buildings are built and or renovated? Because I mean, there are thousands of charter schools around the country, and so I'm sure you have to leave some on the sidelines, right, and not engage with them. How does that process look?
Well, usually, a charter school, and again, it sort of depends, because you could sort of put the schools into, well, a number of different subsets. But let's say, generally speaking, you have what we would call single site or sort of smaller operations, and then you have the larger charter school networks. And they're both good. We finance all kinds in both different subsets. But let's just take sort of the single site as an example, because that's earlier in the growth cycle of the school. A group of dedicated founders and parents or whatever start a charter school for a variety of reasons. And sometimes that's in just kind of a lease space, whether it's a church, a Kmart that's no longer in operation, or a commercial building, and all of a sudden enrollment starts growing. They say, well, we really need our own facility. We need to kind of be masters of our own destiny and not be subject to, a landlord, et cetera. So then they decide, okay, we want to, buy a building, we want to build a building, whatever it is. And because it takes so long to grow equity and money in order to buy something, they're going to have to borrow. And back in the day, the bond market was very nascent, and it really wasn't used to, these sort of different type schools, So, then it was a little tougher to get them to understand that this is still a growing enterprise. So the school would come to us or someone like us and say, look, we want to do this. What do we need to do? And we would generally say, all right, we need, 2 to 3 years of experience under your belt, because those tend to be the riskier parts of a life cycle of anything, any nonprofit. And we wanted a couple of years of audits to kind of show performance. And then we wanted to look forward to kind of financial projections and what the plan was to make sure it made sense for us to show to our investors. And so that whole process, takes generally a couple of months. So we sort of vet these before we even suggest a school do this, because the last thing we want to do is get involved in something where it just doesn't work out. That's in no one's best interest, including ours. So we want to make sure we sort of scrub these a little and say, does this make sense? And is it in the school's best interest? And I'm saying bond issues, we do other types of financing. We arrange some loans from banks and some other tax advantage types of borrowing. But if we focus on most of the things that we've done, it's been in the what we call the capital markets, the bond market. And then you're going to investors that are used to understanding this type of a story.
And do you, in full disclosure for folks listening, at Albert Einstein Academies, we went through the process that you just described about 11, 12 years ago on our middle school site. And it's been fantastic. The site at the time was a Stephen King-esque abandoned hospital with holes in the wall and bathtubs in the hallway. And I remember you brought out a team of investors or representatives of different investment funds to walk the building. And I think some of them ended up investing and some of them just wanted to get the heck out of Dodge and go play golf. Is that a common practice? Do you have to do that type of a sell for investors, or is it now that there's more knowledge and understanding in the sector and there's a little bit less of the need to do a kind of a horse and pony show?
Yeah, it's kind of both, or everything that you just said. So there are some investors that still want to do a site visit, and we encourage that. With our larger clients, some of our charter network clients, sometimes we do a roadshow where we actually go to their offices because, certainly since COVID, I think it's been harder for some of the investors to travel as much as they used to. But that being said, the major investors tend to be located on both coasts. There's a large faction of investors, of course, in New York City, but also in Boston, Chicago, the Bay Area, Los Angeles. That tends to be where some of the larger investors are. Sometimes they can travel, sometimes they can't. If it's something that has already been in the market, they don't probably feel the need for doing that. But I always think it's a good strategy to try to get them to make a site visit, because I think the passion comes out. Just seeing the real estate portion of it is usually generally a good thing. So we try to encourage that, but it's become a little less common than it used to be.
How do you get investors and also bond rating agencies? We didn't talk about that, but maybe that's kind of a tangential to this a little bit. How do you get them over the hump of the charter renewal cycle, right? At least, I'm not familiar with charter terms around the country, but California charter law is it used to be up to 5 years, and now in some cases it's up to 7, but it's a finite term. And it's very different from what you described of a school district that in most cases never goes out of business. Even if they're under-enrolled, underperforming, they're always going to be around in some capacity. You get over that hump by simply having higher interest rates and because they're riskier bonds, or because I know, like, we do our credit rating cycle every year, and it feels like being caught in the whirlpool a little bit, where you hear the same thing every time. Well, you're doing well, and this is positive, and enrollment's positive, but this is just inherently risky, so you're never going to get rated higher than a certain level. How do you get the investors over that hump?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. I think the first one is sort of more fundamental, because most of the bond transactions we do tend to be longer term. So in other words, it's 30 to 40 years, but the charter only lasts, depending on the state, 5 years. Some cases we've done 3 years, even though it's been a 5-year state. Maybe they had a renewal that was a little shorter just for some reasons that the school couldn't get a 5-year renewal. In Arizona, you can get 15-year charters. So it just depends, but in Texas, usually 10 years. But that was the big impediment early on. Investors were shying away because they said, look, I'm not going to buy bonds that go out 30, 40 years when the charter is only 5 to 10. And what we kind of sat down and explained to them, look, there are usually provisions in state laws, depending on the state, that charter, frankly, if they had a 50-year charter, that charter could be revoked if they don't perform financially or academically. Conversely to that, if they do perform financially and academically, there are provisions in the charter law that don't allow that to be revoked, kind of arbitrarily. So I think we got past that early on in the first several years, that most investors are comfortable with the mismatch between the charter term and the term of the financing, that is the bond term. So that's kind of the first part of it. Now, the second part of it is what you talk about is there's sort of a cap with the rating agencies. And again, for those that don't know, the rating agencies are for fee. They will rate any kind of bond transaction, whether it's charter schools, hospitals, universities, states, cities, things like that. They're kind of a proxy for investors to look at, to say, okay, this third party looked at this transaction and said, we think it's rated this particular level. And part of that rating level determines kind of the overall interest rate. So there is a cap, if you will, that you're referring to based upon the risk profile that a charter school has, say, relative to a school district. So there's only one charter school enterprise in the country that has a rating in the A category. It's actually A minus. It happens just coincidentally to be a client of ours, Idea Public Schools in Texas, very large charter network. And so they're the only charter school / network that has a rating above what we call the sort of the triple B level. So just by virtue of this risk of, charter either revocation or non-renewal, the rating agencies have already put a kind of a cap, if you will, on the rating.
So that's a good segue point to talk about Idea Charter School Network. It's featured on your website, and I know it's very large. Could you tell us a little bit about their history, where they're located? I think, if I'm not mistaken, they started out in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and now they've, I think, spread to multiple states, and how you got involved with them, and how what level of support you've provided for them in their facilities journey.
Yeah, sure. So we work with a number of large charter networks around the country, again, in addition to working with a lot of single site schools, and became involved with them in 2007, I think, when they had roughly 1,500 kids in several schools along the Texas-Mexico border. And then kind of fast forward 16 years later, they are north of 75,000 students, mostly throughout Texas. They've also opened up some campuses in 3 other states, in Louisiana, Florida, and Ohio. But our experience really has been in sort of the Texas region. And so they just kind of grew quite quickly and quite successfully, both financially, academically, and I think they hit a need in a kind of a state that's pretty supportive of charter schools in the state of Texas, and also I think demand-wise, we're there to kind of meet the needs of a growing population that was a very kind of high free and reduced lunch population, high, kind of high poverty. Not only, but a very large Hispanic population, and they just fit a need, and they've just been extremely successful. And so fast forward to today, and they've raised I think north of about $1.2 billion that we've helped them with, and raising capital just to construct their facilities, really across Texas. And they're very, very successful. But we've also, in California, we work with the KIPP SoCal region, which is Los Angeles and has a campus or 2 in San Diego, some other KIPP regions throughout the country, Green Dot in Los Angeles, a number of those. And really, it's I guess the point I would make is that some investors do like the larger networks just because it's kind of a usually all for one for all. So if you have older seasoned schools subsidizing newer schools, some investors like that. But you can be a large network and not be successful if you're not kind of paying attention to the things that got you to where you are. So that's why I say that investors like to see both, right? They like to see single site or maybe 2 or 3 sites or whatever versus a large CMO. They have to get into the weeds to really understand that it's not bigger isn't necessarily better. But some investors do like the fact that, if a newer campus is maybe not tracking like they think it will, you've got some backup from some older campuses.
One of the knocks against charter schools from charter school opponents is this, we call it, I've joked around, I think, with Eric Premack about the billionaire curse, that charter schools are backed by billionaires and they're the purview of the wealthy wanting to privatize. How do you and how does your team kind of balance that, right? I mean, you've got schools you're working almost exclusively with entities that are funded by public tax dollars. They have to be successful academically and otherwise in the public realm the same way or better than their brethren who are traditional school districts, but the numbers have to pencil out, otherwise they're not getting a credit rating that's going to allow them to borrow money, and no investors are going to invest. So how do you, as you and your team, go in there and go, we're really the ones facilitating this whole marriage between capital and the operators on behalf of kids? Where's that line between capitalism and then the public domain and the operation of a successful academic institution?
Yeah, I think, the kind of the discussion about philanthropy and charter schools, I think it's a good conversation to have, but I think it's kind of off topic. In other words, if I have an enterprise, I'm going to try to raise as much money as I can from whatever source. And, if there are interested parties on the private sector that want to support, school choice, then if I'm a potential investor in that bond issue, I would like the fact that that enterprise is going to go out and try to get some extra monies. Now, I will probably give more value to an annuity stream coming from the state of California and local property taxes than I will from something that could be there one year and not there the next. But that being said, the philanthropy model, as long as we show a track record of funds being received, we will show that to investors as something that could be likely in financial projections going forward. I just think that the resources that charter schools have versus school districts is so limited versus what districts have with the full taxing power and everything else, that I just think they should be applauded for trying to get other resources to come in and help them out. And it could be paying for additional programs. It doesn't have to be anything about a bond issue. It could be some other things that just improve the academic profile, that makes them more successful, that generates extra demand, a larger wait list, which eventually will trickle down into the balance sheet and the income statement. But I think, again, working across the country, you see all kinds of things. I mean, we work in states that are obviously, fairly, unionized. In certain places like California, we work in Texas, which is more of a right to work state where you don't have collective bargaining. And it doesn't mean one's better than the other. It just means that there are different things that need to be factored in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. And I was actually going to ask you that about how your experience differs region to region, because I know, for example, in California, especially here in Southern California, we've got a really close relationship with our authorizers. And so they're involved at some level, at least in vouching for the success of and the stability of a charter school in your financing process. Are there some states that are much more kind of wide open and less restrictive and fewer regulations, and it's just easier and faster to be able to do these deals?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. Again, I would drill it down to the individual school that's going to repay, because, so hypothetically, you could say, well, maybe there's less friction in Texas or Florida or whatever, where, you don't have as much organized public opposition from certain parties than you might in some other areas. But, we're doing business in California and New York. Those are obviously two states that are pretty active in teacher unions. And that doesn't mean I'm not making a judgment on teacher unions, right? So all I'm suggesting is that investors, when they look at this, don't redline a certain state and say, you know what, that's too much trouble. I'm going to go to buy these bonds for charter schools in Texas, because that Texas school may not be doing that well. You just don't know. I think that's a tangential thing. I think they're going to drill down into, look, is this school doing a good job? Are they doing a good job educating kids? And if they are, then there's probably going to be demand. So the enrollment's going to grow, and the enrollment drives the revenues, and the revenues drives the net income. The net income drives repaying the debt service annually back to investors. So they're going to like that. Whether or not there's, union issues, high real estate cost issues, all those different things that investors tend to factor in. I'd say, generally speaking, if you had a similar credit, in other words, school A and school B are very similar, and one is in a state that maybe is less charter friendly versus one that's more charter friendly, yeah, I think you would probably get a little more interest from investors in charter school B, but it's really looking through that to all these other factors.
If a charter school leader or board member is listening to this podcast, what are some key elements that you think should be in place before they reach out to you with questions about financing a facilities project? Let's put standardized test scores. That's an obvious one, right? That's something that's a Google search. But in addition to that, what are some elements that should be there before folks go down the road of looking at facilities through your company?
Yeah, we do. We've done this actually with some presentations into some of the state charter conferences and the national conference. And we actually try to spend a fair amount of time trying to talk to schools that are for the first time considering doing something. And we put some information together, says, have you considered this? In other words, a charter school, let's say it's growing from 200 kids and they're up to 600 kids. And now they want their own building. And they say, we want our own building. I said, okay, that's great. Have you, kind of projected out where you're going to be, both enrollment wise and financial wise? And have you considered some of the real estate aspects? Does this make sense to build or buy? All of those issues that go into it. And I'd say that probably the trap that some schools fall into is they see or are convinced of a building that maybe they can't afford right now. And so we say, look, we will look in what you can afford now and what you can afford 5 years from now, because if you're a growing enterprise, you can most likely afford more in years 3 to 5 than you can right now. And that's okay. Just like with your facility, we finance growth. But we want to make sure that the school is comfortable and familiar with what they need, because when you get into any type of financing, but especially a financing in the capital markets and the bond markets, there are going to be guardrails that are put into place with some of the documents that say, okay, you need to meet certain parameters. You need to, have a certain type of balance sheet. And if you don't, there are remedies for you to get in compliance with those. And so we want to make sure that people know what they're getting into, because generally speaking, the vehicle and the structure of a financing can work extremely well. For example, in the bond market, you generally don't need any kind of an appraisal. You get 100% financing because it's really a cash flow enterprise. That's what people don't seem to understand sometimes. Well, my building's worth this much, so I can borrow this much. And our point is, can you cash flow it? Can your operations support it? And still give, proper, raises to staff and things like that. Because what you don't want to do is get the financing done, but it harms the program. The program should always dictate the financing, not the other way around.
So how does your team work with charter school operators after the financing deal is done, so that the entity, way before it ever gets close to running itself into the ground, that it stays healthy and does its key core work, but also is able to keep investors from getting nervous? Because as distinct from, what most people think about, they go buy their house, you qualify for your mortgage, they may ask you some questions, and then, let me see your bank account, let me look at your FICO, blah, 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 but then you qualify. Rocket Mortgage isn't coming back in 5 years and asking you to see your bank account. They're assuming you've made all your payments, whatever, and you're good to go. It's different with a bond financing situation. So I, from personal experience, know that you guys have a very hands-on approach. I was wondering if you could share that with this audience.
Yeah, sure. I think that's well put. We have, as part of our services, and usually in most transactions, there's an annual investor call that's required. And so we help schools set those up. And because, we have investors that want to continue to look at financings that we're bringing to the market. So we want to make sure that, we're not just gone once the transaction closes, that we will, as much as possible, try to follow that issue and make sure we know. Now, we do have an advantage in the market. There's a website called EMA, which stands for Electronic Municipal Market Access, which is kind of a catch-all site where, audits are put annually and quarterly. There's usually tabular information that shows how enrollment's doing, if it's new construction, how the project is going. So there's that falls under the umbrella of what's called continuing disclosure, because investors are really partners for 30 to 40 years. And so they want to know, every quarter, every year, what's going on. And it's usually information that you're submitting to your authorizer anyway. So it's a little extra work, but not that much, because you're already providing that to someone else. So we try to stay involved as much as we can on that process to make sure, because it's frankly in our best interest that everything works well, that, these investors are comfortable that we've also kind of scrubbed this prior to our bringing it to their attention, and that we'll continue to follow it, because, if there's ever, God forbid, a workout down the road, it takes a lot of time by all parties, and we'd certainly be involved. Now, knock on wood, we've had very, very few of those. It's in the single digits, over 300 and some odd transactions. So part of that has been intentional. But we've had some schools that couldn't meet a particular, what they call a covenant, that maybe 1 year was a down year. I mean, obviously in California, as you remember, several years ago, when people were factoring their state receivables, there are some macro events that really, you could be doing everything, great, and you just getting hit broadside by things you can't control. So we try to give the investors a perspective that, hey, Albert Einstein's doing great, enrollment's doing super, They're keeping their eye on the financials, but the state of California, the main funding entity for all these charter schools, is having some tough times. So, keep that in the right perspective. And then if there is a violation of a covenant, again, we've had remedies built in that the school on its own, not a third party, can control. And we would want to make sure that that happy medium of meeting kind of their requirements, but more importantly, the school's requirements are going to be met.
Is it more challenging working with a very small charter school organization on a facilities financing project, just based on perhaps the fact that their bench is not as deep as IDEA or KIP or some of these entities that might have 10, 20, 30,000 students?
Not necessarily. I honestly, I think in some way, I mean, those are great organizations, and in growing up with a lot of them, we do feel a certain amount of pride in helping them grow. But at the same time, working with a school, either from infancy or say from year 3 or 5, and helping them get to where they are, in some cases actually is a greater sense of satisfaction, because they may be one and done, or 2 or 3. That is, they may only do one financing, or they may do 2 or 3, and that's all they're going to do, and that's great. So in some cases, we can feel a greater sense of satisfaction because, we are probably there from day one in making that happen. And I think in some ways, it's not that it's less important to a large organization, but for an organization, when you think about it, if you're just going to do, 2 financings over your life cycle, that's more important than doing 2 out of 20. And so they're just a lot of fun to work with. All kinds are.
They talk about, and I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but there's all these percentages where they say in your household, don't spend more than X% of your income on putting a roof over your head. And in California, that gets increasingly challenging, right? Especially cities like San Diego, San Francisco, LA. You got people who are spending sometimes 50, 60, 70% of their take-home pay just keeping a roof over their head. Is there a rough percentage that you try to get your schools to hit in terms of making them kind of those being proxies for long-term success with being able to afford their facilities?
Yeah, I think, again, this is a generalization because you really have to look state by state, but generally speaking, if a charter school in almost any jurisdiction is going to spend more than, let's say, 25% of their budget, that is 25% of their gross revenues, if you're going to spend that on facility cost, that's getting up there a little. And here's why I say that. Technically, salaries and other expenses related to personnel, are deemed to be variable costs, but I would view them as fixed costs. I mean, you can't really avoid the most important asset you've got there, and that's your teachers and your principals and your important staff members. And so really, if you bake that in at whatever the percentage is, whether it's 50 to 60% of your total budget for personnel and benefits and things like that, then you've got 30 to 40, okay, maybe, at the most left over for everything else. And yes, your buildings are important. That's not the issue. But when we see school, and we've done some, it's been sometimes the exception to the rule. We've done some transactions where the percent of the budget has breached 20%, maybe even 25%. But there's been offsetting reasons for that. There's other reasons where that was less of a concern. We really try to see, and that's not necessarily from when you do the financing, that's when you stop growing. So you may start off with 22%, and it may go down once you grow in year 4 or 5 to only 13% of your budget. So you got to look at sort of say, okay, here's where I am now, but here's where I will be, and just make sure that they're comfortable with that.
And yeah, I mean, as you mentioned those percentages, I think it's probably pretty state specific too, right? And context specific. If you're in a situation where your charter is competing with a district where they're spending 80-90% of their budget on human beings,
Right.
and you're expected to compete with them, and you got to be lean and mean and make sure that you're staying competitive and attracting staff, especially the shortages we're seeing nationwide in staffing. So I'm sure that's also a factor that plays in. How did your business do during COVID, in terms of all the turbulence and interest rate craziness, both starting with super historically low and then now really high, and how did that impact the work you do?
Yeah, I'd say this, being in the middle of several transactions in March of 2020, it became pretty interesting with quotation marks around it, because interest rates for about 2 or 3 weeks shot up dramatically. What frankly, the Federal Reserve came to save the day in the economy generally, and then in interest rates specifically. And so by just being there as a backstop and providing, obviously ESSER funding for schools, and they really, the federal government provided a lot of benefits to everybody, right? But it was, generally speaking, keeping the markets calm, both the stock and bond markets calm. Interest rates dropped because the Federal Reserve was there as a backstop. And then, of course, the ESSER funding came in to a lot of people, but especially charter schools, through the Employee Retention Credit Program and some other items, to really make whole a lot of the losses that were happening. Now, depending upon where you were, you couldn't control enrollment loss. So we have a number of clients in New York and New York City, and there were some folks leaving the city because either they could work remote or they just didn't want to live in the city anymore. So there were some enrollment drops. Certainly there were more drops in New York City Public School District than there were in the charter schools generally, but we had some charter clients that had and still do have lower enrollment levels than pre-COVID. They've just adjusted accordingly on the expense side. See, the one thing that charter schools do have the benefit is usually flexibility. So like any business enterprise, if your revenues, are in somewhat of a decline, then you can adjust your expenses accordingly. Where other agencies that might have fixed costs they can't change have a harder time doing that. If you get my drift.
Yeah, absolutely. And California has perhaps it's not a unique challenge. It's probably something that you might see around the country. We've got, being a state that funds schools based on average daily attendance, and we had massive chronic absenteeism at the over 30% statewide. Those are students who we're actively reaching out to have them come back. Is different from those kids not being enrolled. And so that's what's made it hard. It'll be interesting to see what charter school entities do going forward to try to protect against some of those factors that impact the bottom line. And it's been a unique time. Where do you think what do you think the future holds for the kind of the bond market? I'm not trying to put you on the spot as the oracle of Denver, but outlook going forward. What are you talking to your potential clients about, given where we are right now with interest rates? And I'm trying to pretend like I know what I'm talking about. I'm a Google expert, so but I do know that all I know is the interest rate of my home mortgage is 2.5%, and now I couldn't afford my house, right? Because we're at the 6. So what does that do to your work?
Yeah, I mean, just having been in it for quite a while. So In our particular business, in sort of the bond side of things and the tax exempt bond side more specifically, there's an index that tracks sort of the average interest rate over the last 20 years. We're actually exactly almost right on top of the average. So, everybody sort of gets used to, depending upon where you are in the life cycle of interest rates, either high rates or low rates. So we certainly hit the low cycle in 2013 and 2020, 21, and early 22. We were at lows for the last 30 years. I mean, we were just at the very absolute lows. Interest rates have risen a fair amount since 2021, late 2021, early 2022. Yes, if you use a mortgage analogy where you have a 3% mortgage and now you're getting a 6 or 6.5% mortgage, it seems that rates are very high. Well, they are relative to 2.5 or 3% money. They're not high relative to the last really 10 or 15 years. In fact, the index that we follow was exactly where it was in 2018. So my point here is that 5 years ago, we had a number of clients that were coming into the market and financing their facilities because they could afford to do that. And they are continuing to do that even today. We just, it's hard to sort of say, look, well, I should have done this financing 2 years ago. Well, you know what? You weren't ready 2 years ago. And if you're ready and you need to do a project because you're successful and you want to expand, you down the road, you can always refinance your bonds. Like we did with Albert Einstein. We did a transaction in 2015, and then 5-6 years later, we refinanced that. So that's always available if it's economical and it makes sense. I think schools, what we try to tell schools is, look, manage your school to the program and to what you want to do and grow. And don't let the financing structure or vehicles dictate what you do. That doesn't mean you should ignore interest rates. It doesn't mean you should, you can always come up with different structures as we do with our clients to say, okay, maybe we do it this way. Maybe we don't do 40-year. Maybe we do 10-year. We can be flexible and sort of play with the different scenarios of that. But at the end of the day, don't let the market dictate your growth. If you've got the demand and you want to meet that demand, there's usually a way to do it.
Yeah. I appreciate that, because as an operator, we never want to lose track of why we're actually doing the work in the first place. It's not just to try to score the lowest interest rate, right? I mean, it's much deeper and more meaningful than that. I have a couple more questions for you. I really appreciate your time, Brian. Who are your role models in your work? And you've been in this a long time. You've done, as you said, your team's done over $9 billion of projects and 300 plus schools. That's a lot. Who are your role models in your work? Who do you look to for inspiration?
This is going to sound hokey, but I'll never forget when we were starting to do these. This is 2005. We got called by a consultant that was working with a number of schools in Detroit. And if you've never been to Detroit, it's an interesting place. Detroit Public Schools was probably the poster child, at that time at least, for one of the worst run public school districts in the country. And I'll never forget, we had some of the parents coming up to us. They wanted to buy a facility they were leasing from the Archdiocese. And they said, we really want you to help us finance this building because our kids aren't safe. I mean, they weren't even asking about, the general things about interest rates or about terms or whatever. They just wanted to get their kids into a safe environment, and right, where they clearly were not. And we had, sometimes we do a closing lunch, right? We just kind of celebrate. And it's kind of rare, but I mean, you get people standing up and toasting, your assistants for helping out on a financing, and they're the heroes, right? I mean, we're sort of hired guns, but I will say this, I was completely sold on working in this sector after working on several transactions in Detroit and a couple also in New York around that time, because then you see, at least in a small way, the impact that you're making on kids. And that's why these are very rewarding. It's not just an act of commerce, it's just working in this area to allow school choice to happen. Because we also are big believers in school choice. I know, we've had, without getting political here, we've had enough people come after some of our clients saying you're stealing money from the school district. And my response, even though it's not necessarily our place, is, well, first of all, it's not your money. Let's start there. The best analogy I've heard is, would you blame a farmer's market for costing Walmart money by opening up a farmer's market store next to the Walmart? It's a silly argument to make.
Great.
And it's embarrassing, because the results, if the charter school is doing well relative to the school district, everybody should be applauding that, including the school district. I know in the past, although the Denver Public Schools Board has turned over, we at the time had the head of Denver Public Schools stand up in meetings with charter school supporters, say, look, we don't care where our kids go. If they go to district school, great. If they go to your school, that's great. We don't care, as long as they're getting a good education. And you don't find that as much anymore. I don't know why, but I just think that, I think back in the day, the head of the DC public schools said, when it becomes about the parents more than the kids, everybody loses. And I don't think that's changed since she said that. So those have been our role models, at least my role models, working with people like yourself that are there. They could probably be doing something else, making more money or doing whatever, but are there for the right reasons. So we are truly kind of honored to be part of it.
That's a touching anecdote. I was going to ask you what you're most proud of in your work with charter schools, but that you encompass that really in that answer. And even beyond school choice, in some cases, it's a human rights, social justice type of thing. I'm not trying to invoke the far left in my comments, but when people are just saying, hey, we just want our kid to be safe somewhere, like, can you please make it so that this is a building that has heat in the winter and doesn't have holes in the floor and isn't, in an area where the wrong people can get on campus really easily. Like, I think we lose sight of those things. And I had a longtime charter school advisor or observer rather say, look, like, schools with long waiting lists seldom shut down. They seldom implode, right? The market kind of decides, people kind of decide just what they're going to support. And the dirty little secret of this work is that many of the folks who oppose charter schools as a matter of principle end up quietly sending their own children to charter schools if the charter school ends up to be a better choice than a traditional district school in the area. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that around the country. And again, we stay out of the political fray because frankly, it's none of our business. But at the same time, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do, and I think it's also a civil rights issue, right? So it's human rights, it's civil rights. It's just, there's nothing wrong with competition, because usually the rising tide can lift all boats if you're there. And we actually have a few larger clients that have partnerships with school districts. I think that's great to see. It's somewhat limited, but I think it also shows that, this is, I think the market share of charter schools around the country will continue to grow. I don't think that they were paid much attention to early on by school districts. And in certain places where, like in DC, they're 50% of the population of students, in other states, it's 10, 20%. It's still single digits in a lot of states. It's just, to me, I just don't see what's wrong with competition.
Before I get to the last question, Brian, Is there anything that I've left out or you've left out today that you'd like to kind of append to this conversation?
I think again, I think this is a growing sector. We've been fortunate enough to help a lot of schools. I think generally speaking and nationwide, there's been, I want to say 30 to $35 billion of bonds issued for charter schools. We got in 3 or 4 years late into it, and now we've got north of 9 billion. So we've been lucky enough to get a pretty decent market share and work with a lot of great organizations. I would say that, just for those schools that are looking to grow, there's ways to get it done. There are some people that have gotten into the sector, I'll call them developers, that will try to go out and lock in schools into a building, into a lease they can afford, and yet they can get a financing at a much more affordable, lower rate. So I'd say for those schools that are doing that, the advantages of a quote unquote turnkey operation can be good and it can make sense, but look at all your different options, because you want to try to keep that percentage of your budget as low as possible for your facility costs, and just kind of be aware of the different options.
Yeah, thank you for that, and we'll put your contact information in the show notes if folks want to reach out to you. But I can say that as a charter school leader now, and I'm in my almost 30th year, it's amazing that someone this young has done this for so long.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, exactly. We both go to the same barber. That you and your team guided us through every step of the process. I'm still green in a lot of ways related to school facilities financing, but I was really, really green when we started, and you guys were just supportive and understanding. And so for anyone out there who is an expert in school leadership, but is not an expert in the financial side, a firm like yours and a team like yours can be really supportive, and it's almost like having a counselor on the side where you can call up and go, hey, I don't even understand what the lawyers are asking me, and then you walk us through that. So I just wanted to put that out there. That's been great. So the last question is, what's that freeway that goes through Denver? Is it the Route 70, Route 80? Anyway, the main road through town.
Interstate 25 and Interstate 70.
Okay, we're gonna do 70 because when I drive with my daughter to Iowa, that's the way we cruise. You have a chance to put a billboard on the side of that freeway with your message to the world about the work you do, and not only the financial side but the human side. What does Brian Colin's billboard say that will resonate with folks as they're driving by at 70 miles an hour?
Well, I would say it this way. I said we're really proud to be a small part of a successful operation that helps kids learn and grow, and we're just proud to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing it back to the kids, because oftentimes in conversations we get far afield and we lose sight of why we're here in the first place. I just wanted to once again thank you, Brian, for your time today, and wish you all the best. And we'll have to do a version 2.0 very soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for your audience too.
This episode is brought to you by E&E Financial Services through a generous donation to the Eric C. Mitchell Scholarship Fund. Are you tired of financial advisors who are more interested in pushing their products than understanding your unique financial needs? Then it's time to talk to E&E Financial Services. Founded by industry veteran Eric Sams, E&E prioritizes educating and empowering clients to make informed financial decisions they can truly understand and feel confident in. E&E believes in guiding you through the process of achieving your financial goals while providing unbiased, independent advice. Whether you need help with financial planning, portfolio management, or estate planning, E&E has got you covered. Let E&E guide your path to financial success. Visit them online at endefinancial.com or by calling 619-487-9638. This announcement is intended for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. The content of this advertisement does not consider your individual investment objectives, financial situation, or needs. It should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional financial advice. Investment advisory services offered through Access Wealth Management, LLC. Securities offered through Exton Financial, LLC. Member FINRA, SIPC, MSRB. E&E Financial Services, Inc., Exton Financial, LLC, nor Access Wealth Management, LLC are affiliated. Thank you for listening to the Superintendent's Hangout. You can follow me on Twitter at DVS1970. Please be sure to share this show with friends and family on social media and in the real world. Thank you to Brad Bacayal for editing and production assistance, and to Tina Royster for scheduling and logistics. Thanks for hanging out, and have a great day.